Welcome back to Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. We're about a quarter of the way through the season already, which is crazy. How's your squads looking? Leave me a comment, let me know whose stock you're happy you bought and who you're ready to sell on. And speaking of sell, as I do on a weekly basis, I'm looking at some of the players in Week 6 who I think you should sit or try to avoid if you can. So let's get started by taking a look at the quarterbacks on my bearish list. Let's go. All right, let's get started with the first quarterback in my bearish report for Week 6. It's Dallas Cowboys quarterback Dak Prescott. Now, Prescott's been solid. He sits second in the league in passing yards through the first 5 weeks. But this week, I'm not expecting any fireworks. The Panthers have quietly been solid against opposing quarterbacks, ranking in the top 10 in fantasy points allowed to the position. So I'm expecting a good game, but not great. And I think they keep him in the low 200-yard range. Unless they watched my bullish report and saw that the Panthers haven't been as good against the tight end position, and they feed Ferguson this week. All right, next up, Arizona Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray. Now, the Colts have been tough against the opposing quarterbacks this season, ranking 6th in fewest fantasy points allowed to the position. And they rank 3rd in sacks through 5 weeks. Add in the fact that Murray's been banged up all week, and those are the matchups that I'm usually trying to avoid. All right, the first running back on my bearish report in Week 6, Baltimore Ravens running back Derrick Henry. Now, I know it sounds crazy to sit him, and we would have never even talked about it last year, but hear me out. The Rams defense has been the best against running backs in fantasy this season, including being the only team to not allow a rushing touchdown on the season. And since Week 1, Henry's only averaged 37 rushing yards per game. And with no Lamar again to help keep defenses honest, I think this week's going to be tough sledding. The next running back on my bearish report in Week 6, Arizona Cardinals running back Michael Carter. Now, Carter had just an okay debut as the starter last week, averaging just 2.8 yards per carry. But he luckily got overshadowed by DeMarcado dropping the ball at the goal line and losing the game for the Cardinals. But this week he gets a Colts defense that's tough at home and has been top 10 against running backs in fantasy this season. So I'd start someone else if you can. All right, the first wide receiver on my bearish report in Week 6, New York Jets wide receiver Garrett Wilson. Now, Wilson's been awesome this season. He's 7th in the league in receiving yards through 5 weeks. But the matchup this week, brutal. We all know about reigning Defensive Player of the Year, Patrick Surtain. But the Broncos defense as a whole has only allowed 1 receiving touchdown to wide receivers this season. So you're probably still starting Wilson, but just lower your expectations. The next wide receiver on my bearish report in Week 6, Atlanta Falcons wide receiver Drake London. Now, London's got a tough matchup against the Bills this week. They've given up the 2nd fewest passing yards in the league through Week 5 and the 12th fewest fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And they've been much weaker against the run, so I'd expect the Falcons to give them a heavy dose of Bijan this week. All right, the first tight end on my bearish report this week, Detroit Lions tight end Sam Laporta. Now, Laporta's been his solid self this season, but the Chiefs have been a nightmare matchup for tight ends, including giving up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to the position and 0 red zone points through 5 weeks. And the Lions don't need to feed Laporta for their offense to go, so I'd temper your expectations this week. The last player on my bearish report for Week 6, Miami Dolphins tight end Darren Waller. I mean, 3 games, 3 touchdowns, that's a great run. But the Chargers have been one of the better teams at keeping tight ends in check, especially in the red zone where they rank top 5 and fewest points allowed to the position. And I mean, you can't score every week, right? All right, that'll do it for the Week 6 bearish report on Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. We got some great players with some bad matchups this week. If you want to see some players that have good matchups, go check out my bullish report. I'll put a link up here. And we've got early games this week, another London game this week, so don't forget to set your lineups early. Let's go!